Yes, hello, good evening. Join in. Welcome in the Balie. Also for the people who are watching us via the live stream, welcome. My name is Marlijn Geurts. I'm program editor here at the Balie, and I have the pleasure to moderate this evening tonight. And I'm very excited to announce our special guest of tonight, Janina Ramirez. She's a multi-talented cultural historian. She wrote several books, fantastic books and articles about saints, about goddesses, about the Middle Ages. And she just told me that her book, like we're going to talk about tonight, is on the first #1 list of the Sunday bestseller times, and it's very special for a history book. So it's excited to have her here. And that's not just it, but because she's also teaching, I think it's a pleasure to have lessons from her. She not only teaches about the books, but also about classical history, about classical architecture, about Tracy Emin. I'm very curious about that. And she's making documentaries for the BBC. So a lot of talent, but tonight she's here to speak about her most recent and most famous book. It's called Femina, A New History of the Middle Ages through the women written out of it. She will give a lecture about her book. Afterwards, I will enter into conversation with her and also with curator Reynaerts, curator at the Rijksmuseum, about the special project that she's working on, but we will delve into all the details later. And there will also be plenty of rooms for questions from your side. So if you have a question, please keep it for the last part. I'm also curious who are here. So can you raise your hand if you are a curator or some working in the art field, maybe? Yeah, some. Who's an historian in here? Also. Okay, who's really obsessed with the Middle Ages? Yeah, and who's okay, not that much. And who's just really, really fan of Janina Ramirez? Yeah, okay. I think that's great. Okay, then I will give the floor to you. I give her a very warm welcome, Janina Ramirez.
Hello. Right, so I do walk around usually. Oh, thank you. Now, I have to explain why I have a glass of wine on stage. I only found out I was a #1 best-selling author a couple of days ago, and I have not been able to raise a glass to myself. So this is for me. Yeah, it's astonishing. I cannot quite believe that this book that I wrote, thinking it's a pretty hefty academic tome. It's got 108 pages of footnotes and bibliography and reference tools, and yet it's hitting a public in a way that I never expected, which I think comes down to the subject matter. And it's a subject matter that we'll be discussing more throughout this evening that I think really should have been done a long time ago. I shouldn't have to write a book putting women back into history in 2022, 2023. It is so long overdue, it's almost frustrating. Okay, this is me in my many guises. I do lots of things, as you were hearing in the introduction, as well as being a mum to a 14-year-old boy who is this big and a 12-year-old girl who is this big. I wear a lot of hats. That's one of my hats. I do make documentaries for the BBC on a range of things. My recurring series on BBC Two is called Raiders of the Lost Past, and it goes into major archaeological discoveries of the last 100 years and what they tell us about civilizations from the past, but also what they tell us about how the past was plundered 100 years ago, how treasure grabbing took place, how people who, their own cultures in Knossos, in Crete, in Egypt, how the native people themselves were deprived access to their own heritage, their own culture 100 years ago. So that's Raiders of the Lost Past here. I also write for children. When I tell my Oxford colleagues that I write for children, they say, "Why bother? You're an academic, dear." I say, because otherwise I'll have an empty lecture theatre in 10 years. That's why I write for children, to get them inspired and draw them into the classroom too. And I will be talking to you mostly about Femina. This is the first book I wrote, big tome I wrote, The Private Lives of Saints. And I've also, while I was writing Femina, I was writing this book, Goddess, and I want to bring in a little bit about that because it was all being written during the pandemic. And I began both these projects simultaneously, with preconceptions about what I was going to write. And in the process of writing these books, my own preconceptions changed. I was changed in the process of writing these books. Why do we need to be having this conversation? Surely women have equality now, don't we? It's over, it's a done deal. No. There are more CEOs named John than there are women CEOs altogether. Any Johns in the room? If so, well done, Johns. You're doing well in the world. Terrible, terrible statistic. It will take 108 years to close the gender gap. This one surprised me. Only 6 countries give women equal legal rights to work as men. Again, you wouldn't think that's the case, but there you have it. And so we have a long way to go. And we tend to think this journey is only about 100 years old. I mean, later on we'll be talking about collectors from 100 years ago, how they were denied the ability to express themselves through museum collections. The person I begin Femina with, Emily Wilde-Davison, the suffragette, she became the first martyr to the cause, and that was just over 100 years ago. But what I found so fascinating when I was thinking about this was that Emily Wilde-Davison was a medievalist, like me. And she did not see what the suffragettes were doing at the turn of the century as breaking new ground, forging forward into a vacuum. What she was trying to do was regain rights that she felt women had in the medieval period that had been recently taken away from them. And that flipped everything around in my mind. I suddenly thought, right, so maybe I need to be looking differently at the period I study. Now, I'm taking you back 25,000 years. Thought I'd start right at the beginning. Women have always been roughly 50% of the population. And finding them can be easier or harder depending on where you are and what time you're looking for them. Interestingly, back in the Neolithic, the prehistoric, there are multiple representations of women. These were, until recently, known as Venus figurines. Now that's nonsense, of course, because the Roman goddess Venus isn't even conceived of for another 20-odd thousand years. So instead, more accurate to refer to them simply as female figurines. This is the female figurine of Willendorf, and this is from Hohlefels in Germany. And I love these figures because they are clearly celebrating the female body and aspects of it that do loom large when we think about the binary difference between male and female, masculinity and femininity. In this case, reproduction. So the Hohlefels image here, you can see this is a body. Those marks are all contemporary. These are stretch marks that have been carved into the female body. And this is probably a body that has birthed children. What I love most about it, though, is can you see there's no head? Instead, there's a little hook. And what this meant was when you wore it round your neck, your head became the head of the goddess. You were the goddess, which I think shows such creativity right from the very beginning of human artistic expression. And my journey to try and discover why we end up where we do in the Middle Ages and then in the modern age took me then 8,000 years back, 6,000 years BC, to Çatalhöyük, the world's oldest city in Turkey. Amazing place. This is what remains of it today. It's vanishing before our eyes because the stone, the bricks were made out of sand, and as they've been exposed, it's simply blowing away. But what the archaeologists discovered there in the 70s and the 80s was pretty much like a modern city today. Lots of standard-sized, similar-sized houses, all pressed up against each other. And there weren't any streets. The way you got in and out of the houses was by walking on the roofs and dropping down ladders into each of the houses. And 8,000 years ago, they had a communal dump where they would all take their rubbish. They would whitewash their houses every year, keep everything spick and span. It's just an insight into how similar the people of the past are to us. And they too have a form of goddess worship, it seems. This one, she is so formidable. And what I haven't shown you is the back of the statue, where she has a magnificent bottom that sort of drapes over the back of her throne. And she has subdued 2 panthers beneath her arms. She is above nature. She's ruling over nature. What is most fascinating about Çatalhöyük is when they did examine the skeletal remains that were found within the city. In almost every modern cemetery, every medieval cemetery, every classical cemetery, you can tell the difference between male and female bones from a range of evidence. For example, men often eat better than women. They often have different health issues, and largely their male skeletons are bigger than the female skeletons. Well, at Çatalhöyük, they were not. They were very similar. They were eating the same things. They were doing the same jobs, the same labor. Dare I say it, but 8,000 years ago, did we have more equality than we have today? And then you see, oh, whoa, what happened there? That's the whole talk. Thank you. Goodbye. You see how many slides I've got? I don't know why that went like that, so I'm just going to try and flick back. Don't look. Yeah. Then there are other examples of societies that actually work as a matriarchy. In Knossos, in Crete, the Minoan civilization, which predates the Greeks, their entire palatial structure around Knossos was focused on the women. The women were the ones who made the decisions. They were in charge of the political sphere, the economic sphere, and the religious sphere. And here you have, again, 2 different representations of women. In this case, these are called snake goddesses, with the serpents winding round the arm on one. And in the other, she has 2 serpents in her hand, and again, a cat on her hat to show that she is in charge of nature. So all these ancient civilizations were giving me inspiration to think about the relationship between the biological sexes, but also to start to challenge what we mean by gendered behaviors, things that are allocated in the male sphere and things that are allocated in the female sphere. I also wrote this book, Goddess, where I looked at different female figures of belief from across the world. And the thing is, I went into that project thinking, I know what a goddess is. It's Venus. It's a sort of naked lady, eternally beautiful, subdued, quiet. My goodness, how wrong I was. When I started to look at African orishas and I started to look at Aztec goddesses that are sort of made out of obsidian, and Rangda, the Balinese demon goddess whose head rips off and zooms around like a zombie at night, I realized that what was actually happening across the world, across time, across belief, across cultures, was something far less binary. And femininity as a frame is a way of seeing all aspects of humanity. These women that I was writing about in the Goddess book, they were involved in warfare, but they showed every characteristic. They were jealous, they were vengeful, they were loving, they were wise. They were all these characteristics, not just one thing. And that's what I wanted to bring over into my examination of women in the Middle Ages. So, I did a lot of research for this book and for the other book. Luckily, there wasn't much on in sort of 21, 22, so I had a bit of free time to write. And I realised that a lot of work has been done in the academic sphere on medieval women. Beautiful, brilliant books like Henrietta Leisner's Social History of Medieval Women, Eileen Power's study on medieval women. But in every case, when I was looking at these works, I'd cast my eye down the contents page, and each chapter was entitled something like daughter, mother, wife, sister. In every respect, these women were being explained in relation to the male counterparts in their lives. And I really didn't want to do that. So I chose titles for my chapters that I think the first person you'd probably call to mind, if I told you to imagine one of these people in the medieval period, would be male. So the titles are movers and shakers, decision makers, warriors and leaders, artists and patrons, polymaths and scientists, spies and outlaws, Kings, yes, kings, you read that right, and diplomats, entrepreneurs and influencers, exceptional and outcast. And that was really important to me because what I've tried to focus on in this book are, again, like with the Goddess book, the range of human experiences represented by medieval women. Now, I'm trying to do something different here as well, because there are multiple books on women you should know from history. 50 great women you should know, 100 great women you should know. And you'll get 2 pages on Coco Chanel or Frida Kahlo, and they're out of context. You get a bit about their life, and then boom, on to the next great woman you should know. That's not what I wanted to do here. Yes, I'm introducing you to some extraordinary women, but I'm putting them back into their environment, into the culture, and I'm surrounding them with the men and women, a full cast of people who we should know about. When I studied history at school, I got really put off by having to learn data, dates, details. It's all the acts of great men. And we are still in the thrall of the great man today. Just look at global politics. It's too easy to be under the thumb of the great man. But who else is left out of that story? Everyone who isn't a great man, which frankly is sort of 0.1%. Everyone else, everyone of different classes, different races, different disabilities or abilities, different backgrounds, different sexualities and genders, all of those people are left out of the historical narrative. By putting the frame on women, which is the single largest sort of prism, 50-odd%, I think we see everybody. I think we start to see all the other people who've been ignored. And having said that, by trying not to just do exclusionary history, pick on one person and tell their story, I'm now going to pick on one person and tell their story, because I want to introduce you to one of the superstars of the book, Hildegard of Bingen. This you might recognise. Yes, it is the cover. And Jenny and I will be discussing the cover a bit more later, but in this case, this is probably drawn by Hildegard herself, and she declares it to be a representation of the cosmic egg. If anyone else is thinking it's something else, you're not wrong, okay? And I'll come up to that in a moment. But her art is extraordinary. Now, I must put her in context. She's born in 1098 AD, so lives 81 years, right the way through the 12th century in the Rhineland in Germany. And I think she might be one of the most extraordinary people to have ever lived. And yet, who here has heard of Hildegard of Bingen? Oh, look at this. Woo! You're my audience. Great. Well, I can celebrate her with you all. So more of you have heard of Hildegard of Bingen than were excited to come and see me talk. Thanks, everybody. So we know that she is this polymath. And one of the ways I describe her to people is she's Leonardo da Vinci, hundreds of years before Leonardo da Vinci, and better than Leonardo da Vinci because she finished her projects. She was a true polymath. She begins life in this monastic environment in Dissy-Bodenberg. I will talk a little bit about terminology and how these things are important, but the idea that she is a nun may, from our modern perspective, kind of colour how we perceive her. I went to a convent school, and my idea of a nun is a little old lady, very grey-haired, tiny, in a habit, walking along in a herb garden with a ginger cat sort of strolling along, praying, separating themselves off from the world, living a life of piety and quiet contemplation. That is pretty much the opposite of what life would have been like at the time that Hildegard is running her multiple convents and double monasteries in Germany. Her environments were the universities, the hospitals, the music halls, the art centres, the technological workshops, craft shops of the Middle Ages. Anything intellectual, anything artistic, anything scientific, it would take place in these monastic environments. And a nun was someone who wielded power. They'd made a choice, or they'd had a choice made for them by their family, to leave behind the domestic sphere of child rearing, possibly dying in childbirth, being married at the decision of their family. They're removed from that into a space where they are allowed to learn, to think, to explore ideas. And of all of those nuns, Hildegard is the one that just seems to really stand out. Her visions began when she was a child, but she really, it seems, was suffering from migraines. And it was the migraines that was allowing her this sort of visionary experience. And I think you can see that in these images, can't you? They're radial, which is quite unusual for medieval illumination. So they radiate outwards. There's this scotoma, the sort of metallic aspect. She instructed the illuminators of these manuscripts to use gold and silver foil, which is unusual, because she wanted to get that kind of clash you get. Does anyone suffer from migraines in here? Yeah. I had one the other day, and I forgot. I haven't had one for years. I forgot exactly this is how it feels, isn't it? That sort of pulsing, radiating aura. So her descriptions of her visions are like that. But she uses these as a means of exploring the very meaning of life, existence, the universe. She writes theological texts. She writes scientific treatises, natural histories, where she discusses stones and flora and fauna. She's still known as the mother of the natural sciences in Germany. She wrote music, and if you do one thing after this lecture tonight, go home and look up on YouTube Hildegard of Bingen music. It is sublime. She makes the vocal, she's written it for female voices. It's unlike anything else from the medieval period. And in one phrase, she'll jump 2 octaves. It's ethereal, it's otherworldly. So she's a musician, she's a linguist, she developed her own language. An artist, she's responsible for these things. So a true polymath and truly extraordinary at everything she turned her hand to. But what I think she was trying to do was understand the essence of life. When language isn't enough, can you invent a new language? When you can't express in words something that's so profound, can you use art or music? Can we explore it by understanding its science, its makeup? Or do we need to think about it from a spiritual, philosophical point of view? She was casting all these lenses on life. And I can't think of a person alive today that was as capable as her. Luckily, she lived to 81, so she had a long time to enjoy it all. This is her receiving her visions. But as I mentioned at the top, this is not about, woohoo, this is the celebrated human being we should all know about. It's about putting her in her environment and her context and understanding her in relation to the people around her. And here you can see her confidant, editor, if you like, Ricardus, who never left her side. There's some discussion that she may have been Hildegard's lover. Certainly, when she leaves the monastery, Hildegard just breaks down in passionate expressions of grief and loss and anger that she has been left by this woman. But in terms of her publishing career, she's always beside Hildegard, giving her advice, doing her research notes, helping her out. And this is the scribe Volmar, who was actually writing these things down and distributing them. And that's what you have to remember is none of these women that appear in my book, the mystics, we wouldn't know their texts if there hadn't have been an army of monks and male supporters, male cheerleaders, lifting them up, raising them up. So it is about this environment of creativity where a woman is allowed to exceed the achievements of her male counterparts. Pretty much the only other person that's reaching the level of success and fame at the time of Hildegard is St. Bernard of Clairvaux. And he actually endorsed and supported Hildegard and promoted her career. So we are seeing a man and a woman on on this international stage. She goes on a book tour. I'm on a book tour at the moment. And I just think that's amazing, 800 years ago that she's on a book tour. This is how she describes her visions. It's like a trembling flame or a cloud stirred by the clear air. And it's around the age of 38, 39, 40, she begins to get a change in the complexion of her migraines and a change in the complexion of her visions. There is an argument it could have been menopause, early onset menopause, and the change in the hormone balance led to a sort of change in the nature of the migraines. But whatever happened, at this age, having spent 30, 40 years quietly reading, learning, working in the hospital, looking at the natural world, listening to the monks in the church, in the abbey, and just surrounding herself with knowledge, she then feels the need to share it. And she goes out and she says, I'm compelled by great pressure of pains to make known what I've seen and heard. Now, she is also known as the Sibyl of the Rhine because she had the ear of the most powerful individuals of the 12th century. All the major kings and queens of Europe, she wrote to them, gave them advice. Emperor Barbarossa turned to her repeatedly, the Holy Roman Emperor, for guidance and instruction. And the Pope endorsed her work as well. So when we think in these works, I'm going to tell you in a minute, there's some controversial stuff in here, but this powerhouse of male religious people are also, endorsing what she's doing. And she really can chastise them. This is her writing to the Pope. You evil deceivers who labour to subvert the Catholic faith, you are wavering and soft, and thus cannot avoid the poisonous arrows of human corruption. Woo, heavy. I mean, she's laying in, and she's not going to be, punished. She's being supported. Amazing. She was also living through a very controversial time, and she was not afraid to share her thoughts on it. At this point, going into out of the 12th into the 13th century, there was really a rise in anti-Semitism and outright attacks on Jewish communities. And Hildegard does not want a part in this. She deliberately emphasizes the role of both Judaism and the church in terms of biblical scholarship. And at a time where this is not popular to be expressing these opinions, times of crusades, times of international conflict, she is happy to stand her corner and stand up for what she believes in. She also is picking out men and criticizing them for what they may have in terms of misogyny built into them. So again, to the Pope, she says, her visions had been rejected and criticized by many wise men because they come from this poor female figure who was formed in the rib and not taught by philosophers. There's a very sarcastic tone here, isn't there? That, oh dear, I was made from Adam's rib, I'm just a little woman. But actually what she's saying is, do not reject these secrets of God, for they're part of that need which is hidden, which has not yet appeared openly. And we'll talk about this in the discussion, but this idea of not yet appeared openly, hidden in plain sight, there but unseen, that really does seem to underline the role of women in the past. And in terms of controversial opinions, she gives a very clear set of instructions for how to bring about an abortion. So this is what you need to do. And she also gives the first ever description of a female orgasm. And it is heady stuff. So please do enjoy while I chat. I won't read it out because it's far too arousing. But in terms of this idea of a nun who is supposed to be virginal, who is supposed to be really not interested in matters of sex, that front cover, yes, I think you can see what it implies. And this content, this information that even today might be considered controversial within the church, was supported by it. And I think this makes us see the medieval world differently. And I think it makes us see this whole question of the role of the church in suppressing women's rights differently. The whole way I've structured the book starts off in the 6th century, 7th century, with the movement of Christianity across Europe, and how it is women that are taking control of this. They are seeing in Christianity an opportunity for agency. And in fact, this goes right back to the birth of the church. The very early church, when it was emerging in Rome, the very first patrons were women. So when you go to the places like Santa Pudenziana in Rome, that is named after the female patron who left all her wealth to the emerging church in order to found it and set it up. They could see the difference because in the classical world, in patriarchal societies, most religions are arranged where there are a privileged few who are allowed access into a temple, the priest or the priestess, and everyone else is kept outside. Or it could be the emperor and the empress that are allowed in, or the pharaoh. But there's a sense of them and us. What Christianity did, which I think was one of its USPs, really, what made it so popular, was not only do you get a free eternal life thrown in for everybody, and heaven, but also the body of the faithful, the church, is made up of everybody. And when you are an excluded group, that is an appealing idea. On top of that, add the opportunity for women to set up their own powerhouses, these convents, these spaces where they can own the land, they can manage all the trade and the industry and the money and the economics that's coming in and out of it, hand it on to their daughters so they can do the same thing. You can see why it could have been appealing right from the beginning. So what we think of as one of the most patriarchal institutions probably in the world today, the Catholic Church, was actually a vehicle for some of these women to find them a space for themselves. And this was certainly the case in what we call the 12th century Renaissance in Germany. When I show you Hildegard as one individual, you think exceptional, extraordinary, a Van Gogh, Da Vinci, who just exists in a vacuum. She was surrounded by extraordinary men and women. And in convents all around Bingham, there are other women that we only have fragments of information surviving about. This is Hedda of Landsberg. She wrote, and all her nuns, look at them, each of them drawn, each one individual, each one celebrated. They were writing an encyclopedia, an illustrated encyclopedia and history of the world. It has been lost. That book has been lost. But if it had survived, she would have been up there with Hildegard. We've been talking about her. And other abbesses and nuns all across this region were exploring the limits of knowledge, pushing themselves intellectually. I think the best way to understand her legacy is to read her. This isn't actually an obituary, this was written before she died, but it's written by Volmer, her scribe, lamenting in advance how he's going to feel when she dies. A little bit morbid. Who then will give answers to all who seek to understand their condition? Who will provide fresh interpretations of the scriptures? Who then will utter songs never heard before and give voice to that unheard language? Who will deliver new and unheard of sermons on feast days? Who then will give revelations about the spirits of the departed? Who will offer revelations of things past, present, and future? Who will expound the nature of creation in all its diversity? Hildegard. And a woman, a medieval woman. So I wanted to start with her. She actually comes in the centre of the book. The book runs, as I say, from about 600 AD up to about 1400 AD. And she's slap bang in the centre. But in every chapter, what I'm trying to do is challenge our assumption that women have always been the second sex and that our space has always been a domestic sphere. I was having a fascinating discussion with people from the Rijksmuseum earlier about gender, about identity, and I was saying there that in the course of writing this book, I found the origin of the phrase, a woman's place is in the home, was Calvin. And it was Martin Luther and the Protestants who began this domestication of women, the domestic sphere becoming the space of women. And it makes sense, really. I hadn't realised it, but if you think right up until the Reformation, yes, the majority of women are living a very conventional life. They are having children, they're getting married, they're living, running the home, that's their space. But there was this option, this extra of being in a monastic environment, or in the case of some of the later women, actually being lay mystics and lay spiritual individuals. But the fact that they were able to go somewhere else and explore their intellectual creativity, explore the limits of their knowledge. When the Reformation closed the monasteries, the monks were all given jobs within the church. They were paid off with a pension, or they were moved over somewhere else into the new religious world. Women were told, that's it. We're closing all the convents, and you just have to go to the home now. That's it, that's your lot. And since then, the last few hundred years have reinforced stereotypes that are transferable across the world. If you're trying to transplant through colonialism an idea of identity and power, how do you streamline it? Men do this, women do this. And then you can take that identity and transplant it wherever the colonialism reaches. So we are victims of the last few hundred years, but there is hope that there was some other variants of women's positions within society, and there will be again. Emily Wilding Davison and the suffragettes could see that. And the other thing I wanted to smash in this book were our preconceptions of the medieval period itself. We've been told a version of it which is anti-papist, it's superstitious, it's dark, it's horrible, everyone lives nasty, brutish, short lives, and they all live and die within sight of their parish church. Well, this is a map of the travels undertaken by just one medieval woman. This is where Marjorie Kemp went to. Absolutely amazing individual. Maybe we'll get a chance to talk about her later, but she's extraordinary, larger than life. And she lives in Lynn, she travelled all over the UK, she did the Camino, so she travelled to Santiago de Compostela. She travelled up into Sweden, Bergen, over into Poland, down through Germany, back up. And then she did this enormous pilgrimage, going all the way through Italy, through Venice, ultimately over to Jerusalem. That is one medieval woman who, she's just one of many. People were traveling, people were moving. This was a cosmopolitan, global world where cultures and religions and ideas were spreading and exchanging. So we have to challenge that idea. And finally, I know I need to stop, but finally, in terms of our language, our semantics, the way we talk and think about women in the past, I want to challenge that with the chapter that I said, yes, king, not queen, by showing you King Jadwiga. Can you tell why I like her? She's sort of got that vibe going on. King Jadwiga of Poland. Now, I was told about her growing up, Polish-Irish. My Polish grand's house used to have pictures of all the saints on the way to the toilet. So you had to sort of bless yourself 100 times as you walked down the corridor. And she was one of them. And that's how I saw her. I saw her as this one-dimensional, saintly being, an icon, not a person. She was someone that sort of straddled the earthly and the spiritual realms, and I should pray to her and be devout towards her. But that's what I tried to challenge in my first book, and it's what I'm trying to challenge in this book too. These individuals were living, breathing human beings who had the same concerns as us, who were us just earlier, as complicated, as challenging and rebellious and difficult and fun as we are today. We are no different in so many essential aspects of what it is to be human. And she ruled this super empire. Begins as the Polish-Hungarian Empire, and eventually it becomes the Polish-Lithuanian Empire. These are her dates. You can see her here, 1384 to 1399. Short reign. She died coming into her 30s through childbirth, unsurprisingly. But the reason I'm attracted to her is because she's one of only 2 women in European history to have had the title not of queen, but of king. Not Regina, but Rex. And that was because her father laid it down before he died. He specified that his territories would be handed over directly to his daughters, and that they were to be referred to as kings. They were to wield the power of kings. I tried to get to her through the objects associated with her. I am ultimately an art historian, and for me, there is nothing more tangible in terms of connecting with the past than an object. Something somebody held. If that object could speak, it would tell you what it was like to be alive in the 14th century. And my job as an art historian is to listen to what that object is telling me. So often we won't find women in texts. We won't find them in archives or in annals because they've been written out, ignored, just failed to interest later generations of editors and copiers, and their stories have disappeared. But we can find them in material culture. These are all objects that she commissioned. This is across an enormous mahogany crucifix that she prayed in front of in Wawel Cathedral. This was worn by the archbishops, is still worn by the archbishops of Krakow, and it's got her symbol on it. And this beautiful little glass object has her name running around it. Jadwiga had me made. So intimate, so sweet. And the story, I won't go into all of it, you'll have to read the book. Ultimately, it's a romance, a love story. She grows up engaged to one man, William of Austria, and when she is made King of Poland, she has to sacrifice that love and marry a much older pagan king of Lithuania for political reasons. She tries to escape, there's a lot of drama, please read the book. Ultimately, however, she makes the right choice. According to her country, she chooses to marry Jagiello, and they end up forming this new empire, and Christianity reaches the last pagan corner of Europe. But what I loved in writing this chapter was I didn't just want to tell you the story of a historical figure. I wanted to get you close to her. And how much closer to a woman can you get than their handbag? Both outside a handbag signals, it can be designer, it can be this colour, that style, this design, but also what's inside it. When I asked my husband to find my lipstick inside my handbag, he's like, no, pit of snakes. They are intimate, private possessions, and hers survives. This 14th century piece of opus Anglicanum embroidery, absolutely remarkable survival. And the story it tells, I won't give it all away, but ultimately it's a story of romance, lost love, the chaos of a world turned upside down through emotion, and then the duty of a woman, that she has to follow her duty. So I provide various sources, I talk more. Jadwiga is expressing something to the people around her when she's carrying this bag. She's telling people that see this about her life. But the thing that got me closest to her is this. Her personal psalter, her manuscript. It was made for her by one of her best friends, the Bishop of Krakow, and her monogram and her name is all over it. Now, it's written in 3 languages. She could apparently speak 7 languages, and that gives us an insight into how intelligent and brilliant she was. But the thing I love is peppered across this manuscript are astrological symbols, puzzles, games for her to play while she's reading, and if you spot carefully, both Yoda and Gandalf. So she was obviously into fantasy fiction. There's so much more I could tell you about so many individuals, but this book is about putting the power in your hands. The phrase I open it with is, you cannot be what you cannot see. And so many of us have been written out of the historical records. We haven't been able to see ourselves. So now we can go and find ourselves. This is just my little contribution. But every one of you now have the skills, the tools, the opportunity with the internet, with archives. Go to your local museums, go to your local churches. Find the stories that are interesting to you and tell others about them. It's the best time to be engaging with the past. It's an exciting time to be engaging with the past. Thank you all so much for listening to me. Now I can have a sip of wine.
Yeah, you deserve that.
I do.
What a fantastic
well
story.
earned.
Thank you. It's a lot we already got, but let's delve into a bit more. We will include Jenny in a couple of minutes, but just maybe from the very, very start, were you always obsessed by the medieval times?
Oh, that's a great question. Actually, that was such a good question you made. Someone drop that right. I didn't start off being interested in the medieval. I knew I was interested in the past.
Yeah.
I had this vivid memory of going to, there's this amazing palace in England called Hampton Court Palace, which was established by Cardinal Wolsey, taken over by Henry VIII, the site of all that drama of the Tudor dynasty. And there's this one room, it's the great kitchen, that leads to the corridor that goes up to the Great Hall. And there's a threshold, a step. And it's completely worn down in the middle. And I was 7 years old, and I walked over this step, and I just stopped. And it was like the whole of time was telescoping, and I thought, tens of thousands of people have walked exactly where I'm walking. Yeah. And tens of thousands of people after me will walk where I'm walking. And really, that was it for me. Destined for life as a historian. Whereas my brother, on the other hand, couldn't give a fig about anything old. He's in business and he likes now and the future. Yeah. Whereas for me, I don't think you can understand now and the future without understanding how we got here. So yeah, I knew I was going to be a historian, but as I said in the talk, I found doing history at school made me fall out of love with it. I felt as a discipline, it was boxing up facts, empirical information, and telling it to me through, this is a fact that you should know and memorize. There wasn't any human feeling in there. So actually I went to university and I did literature. And then I found out about medieval literature, starting off with Chaucer and then the Old English poems, which are so beautiful, absolutely beautiful, over 1,000 years old, but just such rich literature. And through the literature, the arts, the archaeology, I kind of came full circle back to history as the other subject.
But were you then back in the classes and then taught about Middle Ages and medieval times in a really classical way or not?
I don't know. I mean, no. By the time I got onto my master's, I was very lucky because I was able to take kind of extra options at Oxford in archaeology, material culture. So right from the off, I realised that this literature didn't exist in a vacuum. I think you can study a great writer and just read their text and not even spare a thought for where they lived or what they dressed like or their environment. But with the early medieval stuff, you really have to know about the art, the architecture, the environment. So I think I was becoming an interdisciplinary medievalist without even realising it. Yeah. And then when I got to do my master's, I had this sequence of inspiring tutors who they had this sort of level of passion for it. And then it stamped itself on me. I was like, and also, I love a historical underdog. There's too much on the Renaissance and on the Romans. I want to do the bit that everyone calls dark.
The most difficult, maybe.
Yeah. The bit that no one else wants to look at.
Yeah, and if you, how many years of research are in this book? I was just wondering, listening.
This is pretty much all of it. I mean, Private Lives of Saints, the first book was really growing on my thesis. And then this is everything since. And I think the reason I found this book satisfying to write was, I've spent the last 20 years or so as an academic, as a researcher, as a presenter, as a public speaker, as a mum, as a teacher, and I've been doing all this stuff intuitively, looking out for people who've been excluded from the narrative, working up an interdisciplinary approach, putting individuals within their societies and landscapes, but I'd never synthesized it in one book.
Yeah.
And this was the first time I brought it all together. Yeah. And it just made sense. I was like, that's what I've been doing for the last 20 years. Right. There was a method to the madness.
Yeah, but intuitively, it almost sounds as if you're just it's so much research into it and so much evidence that you said, I have 108 pages of reference. So intuitively, it sounds a bit like...
I think, but when you're built to research, you kind of know. My biggest concern was, there'd been I can't even remember the name of the book now. There was a book that came out as I was writing this, where the academic had misreferenced something, and they'd pinned their whole argument around a phrase that they'd wrongly translated. And they pulped all of the books. And I had the fear of that in my head. I must not get a single thing wrong. And so I referenced everything. I triple-checked everything. I'm like, this is bulletproof. This is absolutely bulletproof. So I think my desire to reference really deeply came partly from that insecurity, but also partly because I wanted to provide a toolbox for other people. I wanted to say, if you read this sentence and you find it interesting, there's a reference to that. And then there's a book on the back of that reference, and you can go off and do it yourself. So it's sort of a toolkit. It's a do-it-yourself book.
Yeah, it sounds quite easy if you just explain.
When I say it like that.
If to get a bit into the process that you do, you start with an object. There's almost, like you said, it's a new terrain or field of research. How do you, if you discover this object, how do you start thinking? How do you start building that narrative? Because
this is just what we were talking about in museums today. We were talking about this because, as I say, it's so hard often to find, certainly women, but people of lower class status, people with disabilities, people of different races, finding them in narratives, in text, is really hard. So I've been inclined to use objects as the starting point. But then that's when you start to broaden out the spider's web, if you like, of research. Yeah. So, for example, when I was doing Jadwiga and I found the handbag, I then went and did a bunch of research on the archaeology of Kraków in the 14th century. You know, what buildings were where, and what was the typography of the city like? What would she have seen? Would she have seen that tower? What paintings would she have seen? What was around her? Who else was in the city at the same time as her, and what were they writing? So you sort of go off on these spiders' webs of research, and I don't know. As long as it's painting a picture, I feel like that's part of where I'm going. I'm not making any new claims about the past. I'm not.
For example, this handbag, has it been researched often before? Yeah. And do you tell a new story about this handbag?
Yeah, yeah. I found some new sources as well.
Yeah.
Which is very exciting.
Yeah.
There's an element of detective work, but there's also an element of storytelling.
Yeah.
History is a humanities subject, and we bring our imaginations into recreating an archaeological site. We bring our imaginations into unpacking a painting or an image, and it's the same with these stories. I'm having to flesh them out with other evidence from other areas. I always say with the medieval period, it's like doing a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle, but you've only got 5 pieces. And you're sort of pulling other ideas, other things in to build the picture up.
Yeah.
And in my case, I'm rigorous. I want to make sure everything is absolutely based on evidence from the time. But using that evidence, I then try and bring the individual out.
Yeah.
But there's only so much we will know. Again, we were discussing this, but in the book I write about the Birka warrior woman, the Swedish woman that was buried with all the accoutrements of a Viking warrior, full armory of weapons, 2 horses, sacrificed in the grave, and 2 X chromosomes were discovered after 100 years of her being declared a man. It transpires it's a woman. But what did that woman look like? How did she dress, speak? What clothes did she wear? How was she perceived by others? Did she perceive herself as a woman? How do we then add the elements that are intangible and lost to the historical record? We can't.
Yeah.
But it pays to think about them, and it pays to bear them in mind, that we only have a small insight. Let's look at that insight and then try and understand the past.
Yeah, yeah. I think we have to include Jenny because we're already delving into all the research methods. Our second speaker of tonight, Janina Reynaerts. She's curator at the Rijksmuseum, specialized in 18th and 19th century paintings. But she's also, and I think that's very interesting, leading the project Women of the Rijksmuseum. It's a 4 years research of the Rijksmuseum, how to represent women in Dutch history in the collection, actually, of the Rijksmuseum. Very welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. You just came home just came back from holidays, and you were reading Janina Ramirez on your holidays. What did you think about the book?
Well, I connected very much, of course, to what you were doing, because what is very important, the book is object-based. And in a museum, of course, every question comes from the objects in the collection. So there was an immediate connection there. And also, what I find very important is that it's also very well researched. Well, we were talking about all the references, but it's also very accessible. I mean, go and read the book because it's really a page-turner. I read it on holiday, so... And
alongside detective novels, so that's how
first the
readable
detective
it is.
novels, and then this. But it's you present it more or less as a detective novel. Every chapter starts with a discovery, and that discovery immediately puts your assumed image on the period in a sort of different light, in a different lens of whatever. So that is very much what we are doing at the Rijksmuseum. Because, well, you also use the phrase hidden in plain sight. We have, for instance, all these portraits of women on the wall. And I was discussing earlier that, me too, I wrote text about these women, how they are painted, who they are the wife of, and what a beautiful dress and pearls they're wearing. And it's not such a big effort to delve into their biography. So that's what we're doing now.
And for you, like personally, when did you make that change? Because you're working for quite some time there. You have been doing all those descriptions about the ropes and the painting and the strokes of the paint. And then you start realizing, hey, there's also a different narrative to tell.
Yes,
Where did that start for you?
I'm totally not a feminist writer. I must honestly say that I've only recently bought my first work by a female artist. So it's really something, an awareness, which of course comes from the way society is gradually coming aware of the stories which are not being told. We always focus on the stories which are being told. We repeat them all the time. So they become a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. And then all of a sudden you think, okay, but these are stories I left out. And once you ask that new question, it becomes so interesting. Because for one thing, it turns out that you can find the answers fairly easily. It's not that difficult to do your research. It's just asking the right questions.
Yep.
And how does it, because Janina was just like presenting this amazing history, and then I'm thinking about like how I was thought about medieval ages, and I thought, okay, you have this and this. That's like in art, and you thought about about the church and the way this history has been framed for us. Like if you look at art history, is there a similar point of reference that you can say then we have maybe went into the wrong direction, and now this is the reason that we are looking at it?
It starts with art history being a 19th century discipline, basically. I mean, there are some earlier, especially life stories. Vasari wrote the lives of the artists, and there are some sequence to that. But the profession or the discipline of art history is a 19th century phenomenon. And for instance, one of the first things which these male, usually, not only, but usually male art historians did was making selections, because you cannot tell about everything all at once. So you start making selections. Okay, we choose the artists which have a studio, which immediately leaves out a lot of women, because women were not in a position to have a studio. So you find women far more working on works on paper. They are very well presented in the world of engraving, for instance, and in drawing. But having a studio means you're separate, your own room. There is this, I always mention this, so bear with me, everybody who heard it already 10 times, but there is the wonderful book by Virginia Woolf, the famous lecture, A Room of One's Own. That gives you the possibility to be creative, to be concentrated, to be on your own and do something.
In fact, sorry, just to interrupt for a second, one of the things I get asked a lot is about, one of the people I write about a lot is the anchoress Julian of Norwich. It is a woman, 14th century anchoress, and she chose to be buried alive, basically, in a room. Gets the last rites. She goes into this room, which is not much bigger than the space we're in here, and she spends 30 years in there. She has a maid bring her food, and she has a cat. But apart from that, she's in this room. And all my students are horrified. Like, what sort of weird decision is that? She writes this book, Revelations of Divine Love, the most perfect first book written by a woman in English. And because she was in her own space, she had autonomy, she had control over her destiny.
I think that's a bit excessive.
I don't know. Sometimes it appeals.
It does, absolutely. Especially the cat.
Yes, as long as I've got a cat.
No, but it's very important that you have your own space and your own agency. And of course, many women were supposed, like you said, to be a wife and a mother, etc. So that immediately was a kind of erasure of a group of artists, or makers, as I would prefer to call them, from art history. So then it goes on. Because if you don't have a studio, you don't have pupils. So you're not making school, so to speak.
And even deeper than that as well with art history, one of the biases is that there is the fine arts. There is sculpture, architecture, painting. The stuff I work on isn't. It's useful. And it isn't art for art's sake. It's crafts, it's jewellery, it's embroidery, and all of those are the most beautiful expressions of the artistic creativity of the time, but they weren't celebrated as the three graces. And so that starts to exclude women. And then the canon, there is a canon in every discipline. These are the people you should know about. And of course, when you're teaching these subjects, you have to start somewhere. And the canon has been, education is at the heart of it all.
Well, when I studied, we had this huge book, thick, and History of Art, no woman in it. And I didn't even question it, actually. I wasn't aware of what was lacking. Because what you, like you say, what you cannot see, you cannot think about.
And then because what you're doing with the project, with this team that we met this afternoon, it's not to make a new canon or to say like these are the women in art you need to know about, but you want to make it a permanent focus in the Rijksmuseum collection. Can you, like, you brought some examples because I think that helps us a bit to see what you're doing.
Well, this is about the project, so very, very quickly what our mission is. So it's about equal representation. It's about getting the balance right. So if you do not have 50% of female artists in the 17th century, then you should not be wanting to have them, you know. Of course, there were less women artists, but we do not know them and we should know them better. Then embedding it in the female narrative in our DNA is the museums, and making it available like the Femina book, which I think makes the story very accessible, and that's very important. And sustainability. We do not want to become the next feminist wave. We want to remain. So we do it methodological by research. That's very important. We put in young scholars because they have fresh eyes. They are not brainwaved as my generation is. And we, of course, and that's of course a huge thing of having a Rijksmuseum as a tool, basically, you can put out the results and reach many people. And that's also very important. And then there is the milestones, how we want to achieve that. But an example is, for instance, the next one. This is, I'm not quite sure it's too light, but this is a small portrait. It's about this big. It's from the Middle Ages. And it's Catharina van Hemesse, a portrait of a woman. And what's very important is that I'm not quite sure you can see it, but on the right-hand corner, she signed and dated it. Catharina van Hemesse, pink sit, meaning I painted it 1548, which is pretty early for dating and signing.
These are fantastic.
Yes, they are wonderful. And I show here from the Kunstmuseum in Basel her self-portrait, where she tells, and that's also well open for discussion what it exactly means, but I, Catharina de Hemesse, I painted myself, basically, or I painted this painting, and I was 20 years of age.
I mean, we've sort of started to add people like Artemisia Gentileschi into the canon. And then there's individuals like this that aren't known or
She's the first painter, well, she was fairly known at her time, actually. And she's the first painter, a female painter from the southern Netherlands who signs and dates.
Amazing.
And that immediately puts female agency on the front. You could say she's expressing herself here, even though this is not, our portrait is not a self-portrait. But we had this portrait, and I put it down there, since 1878 in our collection. And I mean, in the 20 years that I now work at the museum, it's a little bit grandma's telling, but she was only put on show in the last 3 years because she was not in a good condition, because there were layers and etc. So she needed to be restored. And when you look at the production of art and portraiture at the period, it might not be the best portrait we have, but it's an early portrait painted by a woman. So we had her restored now because of the project, and now she's on show. You can all go and see her.
There's so many layers to this, isn't there? Because on the one hand, yes, she's in a bad state of repair, probably because, as I said with texts, it's almost like she's not worthy of attention.
She was neglected.
And then question of taste. Is she good or is she not? Well, who's deciding? Male.
Because you often hear the argument, for example, like you have, that's true of feminist lens, but then you're losing quality. And
exactly.
You are always on a team.
Yes, but quality is also a historical quality.
Absolutely.
We have here, and it's of course it's also a very moving portrait in a way. So there are all kinds of qualities you can define. So this is something which is about a maker, because the project is about three groups of women. It's the makers. We are not using the word artist so much, because artist is this romantic figure, you know, sitting in the field before an easel, Van Gogh-like, and working on her or his own. Well, most of art history are professionals who are working together and making a product of art. So that is what we are calling it. But the other, and that is the next slide, is one of the also the little sculptures. We have 10 of them in the Middle Ages gallery. Catharina van Hemesse you can see there as well. These are 3 of the so-called pleurants. So these are the figures mourning the death of Isabella of Bourbon, whose tomb they are standing around. And we have 10 of these surviving sculptures. And what's interesting, they were commissioned by the daughter of Isabella de Bourbon, that was Mary of Burgundy, a very interesting and powerful duchess she was.
And patron of the arts.
Yes, and also she reigned over the Netherlands at this period. But what's important, that female commissioners and female donors and collectors have also disappeared from history. So we're bringing those in.
And how are they
too.
written out of it then, in a way?
Well, in this case, it wasn't, because she was important enough for her name to be mentioned. But female collectors, for instance, from the 19th century, who donated collections to the Rijksmuseum, have been made invisible because their husband's signature was the only viable one to be put underneath the whole contract of donorship. So their names simply disappeared. And that's also very important. So now we are working in a project which is linked to our project called The Other Half, with 20 other Dutch museums, in looking into how many female donors do we have. And what is so interesting, it turns out that many of these donors, we haven't got the figures round yet, but it's striking that many of them give their collection to several museums. They split it up. While men, of course, we very often know them, they give their collection to a museum and they want their name put on front.
Yeah, yeah.
Museum Boijmans van Beuningen.
A wing.
Yeah. And there are women who did it. We have the Museum Krüller-Müller, we have the Singer Museum, which is supposedly to be William and Anna, but basically it was Anna's collection. So we are really looking into that part of museum history as well.
Yeah. And it's funny again, because we were talking about this before with female, one of the chapters is patrons and artists, and in terms of patronage of the arts, particularly when we're thinking more in terms of crafts as well as arts. The medieval women were primary in many ways in being involved in the making, but also in the patronising. We were talking about Geoffrey Chaucer's granddaughter, Alice de la Pole, creating an entire kind of artistic community in Yuan with female artists where she patronised everything, and it all still survives. And she was able to sign it all in her own name, pay for it all by herself, and yet you get to 1900... And the women are having to have their husbands sign things for them. So it's like a step away.
And also you write about the tapestry of Bayeux, which is the big tapestry which was formerly in the cathedral. And that was made by women and either commissioned or devised by a woman.
Yeah.
So they are there, but we just erase them from history.
Yeah, and if you take a big picture, and because you said in your story, if you go back to the Middle Ages, maybe the community and the position of women was way more diverse and interesting than we think now. Absolutely. Is that the same if you look at art history? That like now that you go back with new eyes, that you think actually, those periods are, it's not such a...
the next slide and take the next one. It's a good example. Oh, this is Mary of Burgundy, but okay. Another one, please, and then one more. We'll forget about her.
Okay.
Yeah. We might come back to her. But this is a project which we did with the University of Amsterdam, with Judith Norman, who is also very much working on a project of female impact. And her students, we gave the assignment to look into pendant portraits, so a portrait of a man and a woman belonging together, from our depot, where you have the titles, in this case, Lieutenant Admiral Aert van Ness, Geertruide den Dubbele, wife of. So the seminar was called The Wife of. And we let them look at these portraits and said, okay, look at what you can find about the woman, because there was no information. And they came in 6 weeks' time up with wonderful information. And this is a very telling one, because we do not know that much about Geertruide den Dubbele, but we know about other wives of admirals. For instance, the famous wife of famous Admiral Michiel de Ruyter. And they had the task, while the admiral was on sea, to equip the ship with men and maybe also women on the ship, food, etc. So all of a sudden you start looking far better to this painting. And you think, okay, it's not just her and the pearls and the dress. No, on the background you see this ship in calm waters. His ship is in bad times, and people are waving the ship off. She has just equipped and foraged this ship. So that's, of course, an interesting story then, all of a sudden. And also note her posture. She is standing, not demurely with something in her hands and like this, but she's taking a stance, which actually is a stance which was very fashionable and stood for manliness. And I have the next slide, which is the ultimate male portrait. That's the standard bearer of Rembrandt van Rijn, which we now all know. And he's standing in the same way. He's making himself a broad man. She's doing the same thing. And what this also tells us, we have several examples of these stories of man and wife, is that it's about partnerships. So all of a sudden, 17th century history is not about the man traveling outside and being active and the woman staying at home and having children. No, they have together they have a business.
This is absolutely fascinating for me, and it's chiming with me because a book that was being written by my colleague in Oxford at the same time as I was writing Femina, her name's Marion Turner. She was writing a book called The Wife of Bath. And that's from Chaucer's tale, The Wife of Bath. And she's a fictional character, but Marion has written the book as if she was a biography of the Wife of Bath. So she starts off saying what's extraordinary about her. Chaucer has written this three-dimensional, larger-than-life, ballsy, brave, bold woman of the world. And how over the centuries, that version has been changed, adapted. Each century, more misogyny has crept in. The most misogynistic representation of the Wife of Bath in all her research was in the 1970s.
Yeah.
That was the worst, the most sexualized, the most dehumanizing.
Yeah.
So it's almost as if we've got, these roles of gender have become more and more entrenched as we've come up to the present day. And now we're having to deconstruct them, when in fact, you're looking at portraits there that show that woman in a position of power.
Yeah, absolutely. And it also shows that she could read, she could touch it. Things like that. But it also, of course, this business was still, in a way, even though he was for years at sea, attached to the home. And I think the division of labor, once work is outside the home and the home is the place where you rear your children, etc., then this division between the male and the female functions is becoming stronger and stronger. And that's, of course, in especially the 18th and 19th century.
Yeah, and what are the most, because these are all women who have a certain status or a certain
exactly.
How do you because if you want to be really inclusive and write a whole society, you are thinking about non-European women, about lower classes, about disabilities. What you said, like how do you find that, because it's so way more difficult.
It is, but at the same time, it's also interesting that the higher up in society you go, it seems the more rigid the divisions between the genders becomes. And actually, when everybody is, if you bring everything down to a level of survival, be it survival through war, survival through famine, the need to feed your children, the need to get by, actually, there's a sort of levelling of the roles. So in Victorian England, in Victorian English society, for example, the rules that apply to how a woman should behave in high society, tight corsets, very demure, stay, not to walk with a man, or you stay in the interior spaces, those become entirely redundant as you move towards...
But are there a lot of sources left to prove that kind of society?
Yeah, interestingly. I mean, obviously, the further back you go, the harder it is. But looking at Victorian society, I was just saying to everybody today that a friend of mine, Hallie Rubenhold, wrote this wonderful book called The Five, about not about Jack the Ripper, but about the 5 women Jack the Ripper killed, who were always just written off as prostitutes. But what Hallie showed was, no, they were so much... these were real women, and she builds the society up around them using newspaper articles, archaeology, social history, so we can find them. I think it's the same, just what your project's showing. They are everything's hidden in plain sight. It is there, but we've just
but some things are more hidden than others. I am writing a book on the models by Reynaerts. At least one model and her sisters, and lower class people who emigrate, so they disappear very often. And I am, well, like you mentioned the word jigsaw. That's basically what my book is, piecing together all kinds of information got from everywhere. And also imagery, objects are very telling. And of course, there are the archival resources, but people from lower social classes very often simply disappear, even in our archives. And when they are women even more.
Yeah. And it's still the same today. I mean, it's in England, we've got the last vellum maker. So I work a lot with manuscripts. And manuscripts, on the whole, are made with vellum, which is animal skin that survives. And there's one left in England called Wickham Cowley that still does it the old way. And who do they supply? They supply the royal family and the House of Lords. And the documents that come out regarding those people will survive because vellum doesn't deteriorate. Whereas all of us, our records won't survive. Our artefacts won't survive because we haven't got millions of pounds to commission the finest new piece. So it's terribly weighted against people of lower class and lower status. But I do think there's different ways. Archaeology is our friend. I was saying earlier that, if you find something in the ground, where it's positioned, what's around it, what else is happening there, you can start to put that person into a context. And we can do it that way. And we're getting more skills to do that. Technology, DNA analysis, space archaeology, all these fantastic developments. So it is getting increasingly more possible. But will we ever lose the fascination for the rich and famous either? We're still in the thrall of them, aren't we?
Yeah, and they are there. They are more present. That's true. But that's also a question we did not really ask before. We didn't realize that we were looking at the rich and famous. We just accepted that. And now we're asking questions about it. So again, that focus is shifting.
And another question that I have is, you also write that in your epilogue. You have a lot of modern definitions about identity, about gender, and you're writing always history from a perspective that you're living and working in. How do you keep that balance in between, like that you describe how it is back then, without using all those modern ideas that we have about society?
Yeah, I mean, I do try and tackle that at points throughout the book. I sort of say, well, we cannot refer to this character as a feminist because they simply wouldn't have understood that term. They wouldn't have had the vocabulary. And I say repeatedly throughout the book, this is my book, created in my mind with my bias, my interests, reflecting the society that I'm a part of and the future I hope to see. And every historian does that. There is no... history is subjective, not objective. And as long as you are honest and you say, this is why I'm writing this book now, and this is what I hope it will achieve, you can disagree with me or you can agree with me, have a go, write your own. I think it kind of covers all the bases. But we can't be... I think we're beyond the world. When I started in television presenting on the BBC, it was all white men in suits, mature white men in suits, who would walk up to the camera, go, and this happened in 1781, and then walk off. And it was, you've got the fact, be grateful for that information. I'm the expert, and I've given you this fact. That's it. End of discussion. Be grateful to me. And it's not that anymore. It's like, what do you think? What other view can we turn on it? Can we put another lens or another frame on this discussion? What about something else?
But it does, for example, mean that it's merely interpretation.
No.
Because that's what we're doing at the Rijksmuseum as well. It needs to be based on evidence. But of course, the evidence will always be interpreted, but the evidence needs to be there, the basics.
Absolutely.
On the other hand, it raises a question whether... this is a kaleidoscopic view you're giving, and also in the book, of course, with all these separate figures, even though you put them in this bigger context. Is there still such a thing possible as a history? With telling tales, and telling historic stories need patterns, they need structure. You try to get this overview, but is there still such a thing as the history we grew up with? The big
linear
stories,
and chronological.
Yeah, do you still believe in that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is quite a chronological and linear book, surprisingly. It does move through time, it moves through space, it moves through themes, but I think it holds together and it takes you on a journey. I don't think... I mean, this is just one book, and the fact it's doing well is amazing. But in bookshops everywhere. You still walk up to the history department and it'll be 200 books on this battle, that general, this king, that queen. It's not changing fast enough.
Yeah, because how is your book received within historical and academic more
really
fields?
well?
Yeah, okay.
Which is again because I did my research.
Yeah,
Really. I mean, I think what's happening throughout universities across the world, throughout sort of society really is we've had Me Too, we've had Black Lives Matter, we've had these seismic shifts in perception that are filtering through into public consciousness and into academic approaches, which we're still kind of negotiating and still trying to formalise. And I think that's why this book coming out when it did, I needed to sort of ruminate. I needed to gather and learn what I had discovered. I've changed I myself as a human being have changed over the last few years, and people around me have.
Yeah.
And that takes time to generate into academic research.
Yeah.
But it's really happening. And it will kind of hopefully ripple outwards. You know.
Did you change because of the
absolutely.
In what way? Can you give an example?
Not being content anymore with the easy answers. Always asking further, seeing more. And being in a way, I think actually I'm at my most activist in my whole life at this moment. So it's quite surprising, but I think it's true. Because you really want to make a point. And we've set ourselves a goal that in 2026, which is pretty quick, we also want to publish a book on the subject of the collection or part of the collections look through the eyes of the female narrative. And that is a huge task. So there is an urgency, and I feel that really.
Yeah, and how big of this revolution is it if you only look at the Rijksmuseum? Because if I'm thinking back a bit, we are talking about modern definitions and semantics, and then I'm just thinking about the short descriptions that you have to tell a story about a painting. And then
words.
And then I really already think about the fact that only maker or artist is not enough to explain what's happening there. So you, in a way, you have to bring it back to such a small.
Yeah, that's of course difficult, but we're doing that. We're changing labels now. We're having, I hope, before the summer, the first batch on the 19th century, hoping to get people thinking, basically. I mean, we do not want to lay down the law, but we want people to think, oh, wait a minute, this is a way to see this painting too, or this object, and ask for discussion in a way. And get away from the descriptive part and just telling people what they see, but helping them to see something different. So that is a way. And I think institutions like the Rijksmuseum, which are absolutely not known for their very progressive, at least until lately, for their progressive stance and everything, I think it really makes a point that we are doing this now.
Yeah.
And I see that many other museums who do not have the facilities we have are looking at us and trying to work with us.
Yeah.
Because, of course, we are also kind of alma mater for all these other museums. And I think we have to take that seriously.
Yeah, yeah.
It's the ripples, isn't it? We've got a similar thing with the British Museum sort of rippling through, and each country. I mean, I think it's so exciting and invigorating at the moment.
Absolutely.
And is it different? Because then you said it in your presentation, we have so many books of women written out of history, the women you should know about, and it feels as if you're saying we are now doing something different, and this is a permanent revolution or a permanent change.
Putting it in the public eye. I think a lot of art history, feminist art history, has remained in the more academic field. And by putting it in museums, because museums are pretty late in this whole development, you bring it to the people. I mean, it's there, you can see it, you can see the object. So I think that makes it so much more accessible.
And I also think what's interesting now is it's not about binaries in the same way. It's not about, bad men have been writing out women all this time. Bad men, good women, let's find them and put them back in. Yeah. It's not about that anymore. It's about understanding kind of the diversity of humanity, women's place within it, and creating a more lasting vocabulary, a way of thinking about a complex past that we can repopulate with everybody by looking through women as the largest exclusion.
Yeah, complex and therefore more realistic.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because the past is complex.
Yeah, we
just forgot that a bit. Yeah. I'm looking at audience because maybe people want to join in. Davy will help because there's still a live stream and maybe people are watching. So she comes to you with the microphone and then I think we start all the way in the back.
Yay. Crossover.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, I can see
you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for this talk. As a young art historian, it's very nice and inspiring to see the things that I think are important are actually out in a more public sphere now than only academia. I was wondering, how do you look at the feminist art historical texts from like the 1970s? There were already some like pretty big questions about the canon and how it should look like. Do you use these feminist theories that also try to like disrupt the narrative, or how do you look on this wave, basically?
Okay. Well, I always say we stand on the shoulders of those texts and feminists, and not only the 70s but the 90s. Yeah. But I also find that they were very much in the emancipation process where women were better than men. And that is, like you just said, it's not something we are basically interested in. And I'm also not interested in, although it's very clever and good to know, but a history of art without men. I mean, that doesn't bring us any further. We live together, we work together, so we need to write about togetherness. But it's certainly true that there has all this work been done, and we need to take away from that what for us now is viable.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I teach approaches to art history, and I always walk with my students through the methods, the big names, the big movements, and the changing face of feminism in art history across the decades. But when I was asked myself, when I was starting out as an academic, if I considered myself a feminist, I didn't. I've always been, like I say, interested in all of society, as opposed to defining myself simply as a woman. I'm more, yes, I'm a woman, but I'm not a single issue person. I'm a multi-issue person. I have many aspects that I think, and actually, art historical theory has moved from the modernist sort of boxing up and separation of this group from that group from the other into this sort of postmodern flux where we are seeing ourselves as having multiple issues and multiple aspects. And I think feminist art criticism has moved in that direction too. But exactly as Jenny said, standing on the shoulders of giants. We couldn't be here if these people hadn't written these works before us. So we have to know them, appreciate them, understand them, and see how they inform our work later on.
Another question I saw here, somebody. Oh yeah, and there. Maybe first start on your right side there. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Keeleen. These are my colleagues. We teach history at a high school here in Amsterdam.
Hey.
And I remember you said that you didn't, like, the way you were taught history kind of cooled you off from the subject for a really long time. And I was wondering if you have anything that you think we would be able to do, or you would advise people to do now to keep kids interested, so you can have more people in the lecture halls 30 years from now?
That is the best question. Thank you. I mean, I think it's obvious. I come from a line on both sides of my family where every single woman going back, as far as we can trace in the records, was a teacher. And my mum said to me when I was 5, "You will be a teacher." And I said, "No, I won't. I'm going to be a lawyer, and I'm going to live in a penthouse suite and drive a racing car, and it's going to be cool." And then I taught for the first time. I was like, damn it, she was right. I am built to be a teacher. Teaching, education is fundamental to everything we've been discussing. Ideological change, political, social change. It all begins in the nursery, in the primary school. Problems, we're talking about problems and issues of nationalism, of racism, of classism, sexism. These things begin in babies, in infants. Education is the most important thing. So teaching history, the thing that put me off, I went on to do A-level. I kind of enjoyed history at primary school. I liked what it was I liked the way that the subjects interacted. I liked doing a bit of art. So when I was doing the Elizabethans, I would sort of get a picture of Elizabeth and draw her, colour her in, and that was fun. And then when I got to secondary school, it sort of stayed interesting until A-level, where my 2 modules was World War II and the Battle of Hastings. So battles, battles, battles. I got up every day to go into my A-level history class, and it was like, what battle plan am I going to be looking at today? What man has done something on a battlefield that's supposed to impact my life? So I think, avoiding those. But I think also, like we've all been saying, humanizing, bringing the human, really recognizing the fact that history is a humanities subject. It intersects with all the humanities. It intersects with music. I was saying earlier, if we tried to describe what it's like to be alive now to someone in 500 years' time, what would we do? We wouldn't just give the headline of the newspaper or what law was passed in Parliament. We'd talk about fashion and music, and we'd talk about what poems and literature people are reading, what films we're watching, how we're talking to each other, what our language is doing, and what we're looking at. So I think treating it like that kind of interdisciplinary subject actually opens history up to more people and would draw people in to understanding it as a human subject. Does that seem in any way helpful? That's where you're going? Yeah?
Oh, good.
I think it's brilliant. I mean, I'm most of the people who I've had responses from in the beginning for my book were history teachers. And they would go, this is exactly what we want to be doing in the classroom. And everyone's trying. And I think that's why the change might happen a bit quicker than we even think, because the next generation are growing up with a form of looking to the past that was different to the one I had. We've had to kind of get there the long way around. Whereas they're getting thanks to you guys, getting a quick start.
There was here somebody in white. Yeah. Sorry, hier zo, met de rode sjaal. Ja.
Hi, I am a teacher of young children, and and there is in the last years there's more of a tendency towards less differentiation between the boys and the girls, to the point that now teachers are even being asked to not refer to as boys and girls, but as students.
Yeah.
And my question is, how do you integrate this new wave of ideas with your subject, which is very much being a woman and being a girl, and how do you see that developing?
That's really interesting. And I think in the book, as you read it as I go along, what I'm doing slowly across the book is taking what the premise is, which is that this is about women who've been written out of history, and picking away at it and actually showing that each of these women defies expectations of femininity, of womanness, whatever that is. By the end, I'm dealing with issues of transgender, of people who identify as a different gender to the one they're born with, sex-wise. And I think that this is a very important discussion that we're having at the moment, how we accommodate biological sex alongside notions of societally designated gender. And the book shows multiple examples where across cultures, across time, across civilizations, these binaries haven't existed. There's been lots of challenges to it. So in the final chapter, I give examples that go right back to sort of antiquity of an emperor that had multiple operations to try and realign their gender, right the way through to people who have been transgressing through dress, perceived to be the opposite sex through the way they dress. So it's always been there in history. And I think now the difference is that it is a scientific possibility. And so science and technology, yet again, are sort of forging a new path forward. And we are ideologically and linguistically trying to come to terms with that. How do we accommodate these changes? How do we move forward with them? And it is difficult. I've always, I've had a transgender friends since I was very young. So for me, the use of the pronoun they, them it's never been an issue. It's been part of my vocabulary. But for a lot of people to use that, it's uncomfortable, it's new, it's unfamiliar. So we're starting new discussions, and it's obviously going to create opposition. There's going to be people pulling to either side of the debate, and I just offer my opinion. But it doesn't sit at odds with me. I don't find my position as a woman to be at odds with my ability to discuss the diversity of humanity. So yeah, thank you.
You wanted to add something?
Yeah, it's because in under the umbrella, so to speak, of the project Women of the Rijksmuseum, we are also looking at gender issues, and we are at the moment, together with a couple of colleagues here in the room, are making an exhibition, especially on gender, as represented in our collection, but also expressed by people. We do that through, again, objects from our own collection. So you have self-expression and you have representation of art. And it's, of course, it is also a lot about binary, but we find that through the ages, because, of course, we have this huge collection, the whole binary idea is being challenged every so. And so we have images of that. We have people cross-dressing, but we also have costumes, we have wigs, in which we can show that the whole idea of manliness and femaleness, femininity, is changing during the ages. I was just talking about this posture of the standard bearer, which in the 17th century is excessively male. Well, I don't think any man would stand now with his hand like that. It would consider to be effeminate. So these ideas are changing, and that is also what we are going to do under the umbrella of this project, be more, take on the subject broader than just Women of the Rijksmuseum. On the other hand, there were, of course, discussions, but should you then name it Women of the Rijksmuseum? Isn't that too restrictive? And then I'm still saying, okay, 50% of humanity is women, and many of those, and you showed that at the beginning, are still being persecuted, are being medically put behind, research, socially, economically. So there is still a big fight to go on. Yeah. So I like to keep, because otherwise we disappear again.
Yeah.
You know. So maybe you teachers could now say in the morning, "Good morning, girls," start. Just do it all.
Maybe like one last urgent questions, and then we go to the bar to have Oh, you have to choose, Davy.
Hi, thank you for your talk about two inspiring women from the Middle Ages. I would see them as examples of women you would have to follow on your social media. But say like Hildegard and Jadwiga would have a look at the social media or the world or Europe today, be it Germany or Poland. Yeah. What would be their thoughts or feelings looking at society today from where they were coming from?
I think they'd probably think, what the heck happened to the rights of women? When did that all go wrong? No. I don't know. I think it's impossible to extrapolate, isn't it? And actually, this is sort of feeding off what you were saying a minute ago, Jenny, about what we can and can't see from the past. I mentioned a Burqa warrior woman. How did she dress? What did she look like? What did she? Also, we can add to that, what did she think? It's remarkable with Hildegard because if you read the book, which means buy the book, there's a whole detective story at the start of Hildegard's chapter, which is about the saving of this manuscript called the Reisen Codex, which is a collected works. Now, even today, authors don't get all their body of work put in one volume. So it's remarkable that Hildegard's did and that it survives. And across those thousands of pages, you hear her voice and you hear her change and you hear what she's thinking and feeling and how she's responding. And sometimes she's very factual and scientific, other times she's emotional and highly strung, and other times she's thoughtful and mellow. So that's about as close as we can get to the feelings and the ideas of a person from the past. But just in general, I think they would be massively blown away by how lazy we've become, that we don't move and do stuff in the way that they used to. But then otherwise, they would probably see many, many similarities with the things that concern us, you know, loving our family members, rearing children, health concerns, looking after our family members. Yeah, just all love, hate, jealousy. They'd recognise all those things. And I think they'd probably think we're a bit sloppy in our dress. We could make more of an effort. Otherwise, I don't know.
I think we close it off here. Yeah. But we always have an informal third round at the bar. It's already mentioned a couple of times, but you can buy the book if you don't have it, or you can already sign it if you already bought it. If you leave the room, it's at the entrance of the...
Out there.
Yeah, out there. But please be a bit quiet in the stairways here, because there's another program going on. So to close off, I would like to thank Jenny a lot, and
thank you,
Janina, to be here, giving them a very warm welcome.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.